5 months after I moved to Cebu, I opened my laptop at 2 in the morning and typed my old address into the search bar. The house appeared immediately. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. The covered back porch where Frank and I used to sit with our coffee while the mockingbirds fought over the feeder. The listing still had every photograph from the sale. My kitchen, my bedroom, the living room where we had hung stockings for 36 Christmases, and where the recliner had worn a permanent dent into the carpet because Frank believed furniture should be comfortable, not attractive. None of it belonged to me anymore. I had sold the house, I had sold the car, I had sold the dining table and the bed frame and the recliner with the dent, and nearly everything else I owned before moving to the Philippines at 68 years old. At the time, I called it a fresh start. But that night, sitting alone in a rented apartment in Cebu City with the ceiling fan ticking overhead and the sound of a motorcycle revving somewhere on the street below, a fresh start felt more like standing on the wrong side of a door that had locked behind me. I kept staring at the photographs until I did something I'm still embarrassed to tell you. I found the email address of the real estate agent who had sold the house, and I wrote to her. I asked whether the new owners might consider selling it back to me. I rewrote the message 4 times. The first version sounded desperate. The second was too long. The third tried to sound casual, which was worse. The final version was 3 sentences. I asked if the buyers were happy. I asked whether they might be interested in selling if the price were right. I hit send and sat there staring at the screen with my heart doing something it had no business doing at 2 in the morning over an email. Her reply came the next afternoon. She was kind about it, which somehow made it harder. The new owners loved the house. They had already repainted the kitchen and installed a new fence. Their daughter was enrolled in the school 2 blocks away. They had no interest in selling. She also mentioned, gently, that even if they were willing, homes in that neighborhood had appreciated since my sale. Buying it back would cost considerably more than I had received after fees and closing costs. I read the message 3 times. Of course, they didn't want to sell. To them, the house wasn't a mistake they could undo. It was their beginning. For the first time since leaving Texas, I understood something I had been avoiding. Going back wouldn't mean returning to the life I had left. That life was gone, and I was the one who had dismantled it. My name is Helen. I was 68 years old when I packed what was left of my life into 4 suitcases and moved from San Antonio, Texas to Cebu City, Philippines. Nobody forced me to go. I wasn't escaping anything dramatic. I wasn't chasing a man I'd met on the internet. I moved because I had watched enough videos and read enough articles and filled enough pages of a notebook with numbers to convince myself that I had found a smarter way to retire. For the first few months, I believed I had made the best decision of my life. 5 months later, I was emailing a stranger at 2 in the morning begging to buy my house back. This is how it happened. Frank died 4 years before I moved. Heart failure. He was 70. We had been married for 36 years. Frank was a quiet man who expressed love primarily through maintenance. A dripping faucet was fixed before I mentioned it. A squeaking door hinge was an emergency. The lawn was his responsibility and his pride, and he mowed it in perfectly straight lines because he believed crooked lines reflected poorly on a person's character. I used to tease him about it. After he died, I hired a service and the lines were never straight, and I noticed every single time. The house started falling apart almost immediately, or at least that was how it felt. The water heater went first. Then a section of the fence came down after a storm. Then the air conditioning unit, which Frank had maintained himself for 15 years, needed a $4,200 repair that the technician said would only buy me another 2 or 3 years before the whole system needed replacing. Each repair required a phone call, a stranger in my house, and a check that made me sit at the kitchen table afterward doing math I didn't want to do. The house was paid off. Everyone told me how lucky I was. "You own your home free and clear," they'd say, like that sentence solved everything. But owning a house and affording the life that surrounds it are not the same thing. Property taxes, insurance, electric bills that made July feel like a personal attack, maintenance on everything Frank used to handle with a trip to the hardware store and an afternoon. My car was 12 years old and beginning to express opinions about starting in the morning. Groceries cost more every month, and I couldn't figure out where the extra money was going because I was eating less than I ever had. My Social Security plus Frank's survivor benefit came to $2,180 a month. I had savings from the house being paid off and from Frank's small life insurance. I wasn't poor. But I had entered the part of retirement where every unexpected expense arrived with a second question attached to it. If I pay for this, what happens later? If the air conditioning dies completely, can I afford the replacement and the roof that the inspector said had maybe 5 years left? If I live to 85, does the money hold? And if it doesn't, which of my children do I become a burden to? Those questions never came during the daytime. They arrived after midnight when the house was silent, and every financial fear felt like a certainty. My son Brian lived in Atlanta. My daughter Katie was in Austin, close enough to visit, but far enough that she couldn't just stop by. They called. They loved me. They invited me for holidays. But they had their own mortgages and their own children and their own problems, and I did not want my retirement to become one more thing they had to manage. So I started shrinking. I canceled the lawn service and did it myself until the heat sent me inside dizzy and seeing spots. I stopped eating out. I delayed repairs. I drove less. I adjusted the thermostat until the house felt like something between uncomfortable and acceptable. I compared prices at 3 stores before buying anything that wasn't strictly necessary. None of those cuts made me miserable by themselves. What bothered me was the direction. Every year my world got a little smaller, so that I could keep affording the house that was supposed to make me feel secure. One evening, the way these things always seem to happen, I was lying in bed watching videos on my tablet, because sleep had become unreliable, and the algorithm had become my most consistent companion. It showed me a video about the Philippines. An American woman, roughly my age, walking through a grocery store in a city I'd never heard of, explaining what she spent in a normal week. I almost closed it. The Philippines had never been on any list I'd ever made. But the woman looked like someone I might know. She lived in a regular apartment. She didn't own a car. She bought fresh food at a market and took taxis when she needed to go somewhere, and her monthly expenses were less than my property taxes. Her life didn't look luxurious. It looked manageable. That word sat with me. Manageable. I watched another video, then another. Within 3 weeks, I had filled a notebook with estimated costs, converted pesos to dollars so many times I could do the smaller amounts in my head, and begun to believe I had found the solution to a problem I'd been losing sleep over for 4 years. My daughter Katie was the first person I told. There was a silence on the line long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped. "Mom," she said. "The Philippines." She said it the way you'd say another galaxy. She asked practical questions. Where would I live? What about healthcare? Does Medicare work there? What if I got seriously ill? I had answers for some of her questions. Others were based on videos and forum posts from people I had never met. When she heard the uncertainty, she made one request. "Please visit before you sell the house. Just visit." That seemed reasonable. 3 months later, I flew to Cebu with a round-trip ticket, 1 suitcase, and a reservation at a hotel in the business district for 12 nights. I told myself it was a research trip. But I had spent months imagining my new life, and I wasn't going to Cebu to decide. I was going to confirm a decision I had already made, though I wouldn't have admitted that to anyone, least of all myself. The visit was wonderful. Everything was cheaper than I expected. The hotel was comfortable. People were warm and kind and called me ma'am with a sincerity that made me stand a little straighter. I ate at restaurants where a full meal cost less than a coffee at the cafe near my house in San Antonio. I toured apartments. I met a small group of expat retirees who told me where to shop, which neighborhoods were safe, how visa extensions worked. One woman who had lived in Cebu for 4 years said something that followed me home. My only regret is that I waited so long. I visited 3 apartments. The third was a furnished one-bedroom in a modern building with a security guard downstairs and a small convenience store on the ground floor. The agent opened the curtains and light filled the room, and I stood there imagining my photographs on the shelf and my coffee by the window, and I thought, I could live here. The rent was less than half of what it cost me each month to maintain my paid-off house in San Antonio. I took photographs from every angle and sent them to my children that night. Brian was direct. "You're on vacation, Mom. Living there is different." I told him I understood. I didn't. During those 12 days, someone cleaned my room and replaced my towels and prepared most of my meals. I stayed in one of the most convenient parts of the city and spent from my savings without following an ordinary budget. I didn't fill a prescription. I didn't deal with a power outage. I didn't spend a single evening truly alone because the novelty of everything kept me occupied. I didn't need to extend a visa or find a doctor I trusted or figure out what to do when the pharmacy didn't carry my medication. And I always had a return ticket. That ticket made every inconvenience feel temporary. Traffic was an adventure. The heat was something to laugh about. Homesickness never had time to arrive. By the final day, I wasn't asking whether I could live in Cebu. I was asking how quickly I could come back. I landed in San Antonio, and the house felt enormous. Dust had gathered on the furniture. The roof estimate was still on the kitchen counter where I'd left it, which felt like the house's way of reminding me why I was leaving. Within a week, I had contacted a real estate agent. Within 6 weeks, the house was listed. Within 11 days, we had an offer. A young couple with a toddler. Their offer was slightly below asking, but they could close fast. My agent told me to take it. I signed the papers at the kitchen counter. My hand shook near the last page. The agent noticed and asked if I needed more time. I almost said yes. Instead, I signed and set the pen down and understood that I had just ended a chapter I could not reopen. Katie suggested I rent a storage unit. "Keep the important things for a year," she said. "You don't have to decide everything right now." I considered it. A storage unit would have cost less than many of the things I was giving away. It would have been a tether to the life I was leaving, a small reassurance that I could come back if I needed to. But I had become obsessed with the idea of a clean break. Every video and article I'd consumed about moving abroad celebrated the same thing: freedom from possessions, freedom from bills, freedom from the life that kept you stuck. I didn't want to pay monthly rent for a room full of objects I might never use again. More honestly, I didn't want to admit I might come back, so I said no. That decision would bother me more than selling the furniture. Furniture can be replaced. Photographs, letters, and the small, irreplaceable pieces of a shared life cannot. I scanned what I could. I gave boxes to my children. Everything else had to fit into 4 suitcases and a carry-on. On the morning of the closing, I walked through the empty house alone. I had slept on an air mattress because the bed was already gone. The refrigerator was empty. My suitcases stood by the front door. I placed my hand on the wall where Frank's photograph had hung for 20 years, and for one moment I wanted to cancel everything. Unpack the suitcases, call the buyers, tell the agent I'd changed my mind. Then the car arrived to take me to the airport. I locked the door and put the keys in an envelope, and as we drove away, I turned around for one last look. I expected grief. Instead, I felt lighter. That lightness convinced me I had done the right thing. It would be months before I understood that relief and certainty can feel almost identical at the beginning. I arrived in Cebu exhausted and carrying more luggage than I could manage alone. An airport employee helped me with the bags. A driver was waiting with my name on a card. The apartment was smaller than it had appeared in the photographs, and the kitchen had less counter space than my bathroom in San Antonio. But it was clean and furnished, and mine for the next 3 months. That first evening, I stood by the window watching the city lights stretch out below me, and I thought, no property taxes, no yard, no leaking water heater, no roof estimate on the kitchen counter. For the first time in years, I felt like my life belonged to me instead of to the things I owned. The first weeks were easier than my children had expected. I learned which grocery store had the things I needed. I figured out the transportation apps. The security guards greeted me by name. A woman at a bakery near my building started preparing my pandesal when she saw me coming through the door. I joined an online group for foreigners in Cebu, and through that group met several retirees for lunch every other week. Being the new person gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. A reason to be curious. Financially, the plan seemed to work exactly as I'd hoped. My rent was a fraction of what the house had cost. I didn't need a car. I could eat at local restaurants without guilt. My Social Security covered my regular expenses, and the money from the house sale sat invested, barely touched. I checked the accounts almost every morning because seeing the numbers gave me comfort. They were proof I hadn't been reckless. Then the accumulation started. Not one dramatic thing. Small inconveniences that gradually stopped feeling small. The air conditioning failed during a week so humid the walls felt damp. The building manager said someone would come the next day. The technician came 2 days later, examined it, and said a part needed ordering. For 5 nights I slept with 2 fans aimed at the bed, and the windows open to a soundtrack of jeepneys and roosters and someone's karaoke that ran until midnight with a commitment to volume that I found philosophically impressive but practically unbearable. The AC was eventually fixed, but the experience showed me something I hadn't considered. I had traded the burdens of homeownership for the helplessness of tenancy in a country where I didn't speak the language and couldn't always tell whether a 2-day wait was normal or whether I was being politely ignored. Then I got sick. Nothing serious. Something I ate. But I spent 2 days unable to leave the bathroom, and when it was over, I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling fan and realized that nobody knew I'd been ill. Nobody had checked on me. Nobody had knocked on the door. Frank would have known before I admitted it. He would have brought water and checked my temperature and annoyed me by asking every 15 minutes whether I was okay. In Cebu, nobody knew I hadn't left the apartment. When Katie called, I told her I was tired. I didn't mention the illness because I knew what she would say. "You're alone over there." She wouldn't have meant it as criticism, but I wasn't ready to hear it. By the 5th month, the group of retirees I'd joined was changing. One couple went back to the States. Another woman moved to a different island. A man I'd become friendly with started a new relationship and stopped coming to lunch. People living abroad were always arriving, leaving, or rearranging. I had assumed that finding friends would fix the loneliness. I hadn't understood how temporary many of those friendships could be. The cafe employees still smiled when I walked in. The guards still greeted me. But being recognized is not the same as being known. Some days I had pleasant conversations with 6 people without saying anything honest to any of them. Then the thing that changed everything. A Wednesday night, roughly 2 in the morning. I woke up with pressure in my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. It didn't pass. I drank water. I walked around the apartment. I sat down again. The pressure stayed. Then a dull ache moved toward my left shoulder. Frank had heart problems during his last years. I knew enough to not ignore what was happening. I called the front desk. Within minutes, 2 building staff members were at my door. One stayed with me. The other arranged a car to a private hospital nearby. I remember apologizing for how I looked as they helped me downstairs, which is an absurd thing to worry about when you think something might be wrong with your heart, but fear doesn't produce rational behavior. At the hospital, they attached monitors to my chest, checked my blood pressure, asked about my medications. Then someone asked for my emergency contact. I gave them Katie's name and her American phone number. The nurse looked at the number. "Do you have anyone here in the Philippines?" she asked. I didn't. Until that moment, I had never thought of myself as someone with no one. I had children, grandchildren, friends, people who loved me. But none of them could reach that hospital in less than 24 hours. Nobody nearby knew my medications, or my medical history, or what decisions I would want made if I couldn't speak for myself. I had prepared financially for an emergency. I had not prepared personally. The tests came back stable. The doctors believed it was acid reflux combined with anxiety, which is the body's way of telling you that you are frightened and your stomach agrees. They wanted me to follow up with a specialist. I was relieved. I was also cracked open in a way that wouldn't close back up. The hospital was modern. The staff were competent and kind. My insurance covered most of the costs after the deductible. The problem wasn't the quality of care. The problem was walking out of that hospital alone at 5 a.m. and returning to an apartment where no one was waiting, and no one would have known if I hadn't come back. That was the night I searched for my old house. That was the night I emailed the agent. That was the night the panic became real. For the next several days, I barely left the apartment. Every sensation in my chest made me freeze. I kept my phone next to me even in the shower. I checked my blood pressure so often the machine started feeling like a roommate. Katie called every day. She never asked me to come home. She didn't need to. The question had already planted itself and it was growing. One sleepless night, I started searching for homes in San Antonio. I told myself I was just looking. Then I checked apartments near Katie in Austin. Rent was 3 times what I paid in Cebu. I'd need a car, furniture, a bed, kitchen supplies, insurance, everything I had spent months giving away because I believed possessions were holding me back. Now every missing object was something I'd have to buy again. The math was devastating. I could return to America. I could not return to the financial life I'd had before I left. The savings that looked so generous in the Philippines would shrink dramatically in Texas. I would be starting over at 68 in a country where starting over costs more than most people's regular lives. Katie suggested I visit before making another permanent decision. "Come stay with us for a few weeks," she said. "You don't have to solve the rest of your life today." Her advice was exactly the kind I'd ignored before selling the house. This time I listened. I booked a flight to Austin. The first thing I noticed landing in Texas was how quiet everything seemed. The airport felt orderly. The roads felt wide. The air was dry and familiar in a way that made my chest loosen for the first time in weeks. Then I noticed the cost, the rental car, the hotel for 2 nights in San Antonio before driving to Austin. 1 week in Texas cost nearly as much as a month of rent in Cebu. I had expected that. Seeing it charged to my account was different. I drove past my old house. I told myself I would only pass it once. I circled the block and came back. The exterior looked mostly the same, but there were new planters by the front steps and a child's tricycle near the garage. A woman came outside with a little girl. The girl was carrying a stuffed animal and talking about something with the urgent enthusiasm that 3-year-olds bring to every subject. They belonged there. That realization hurt. But it also released something. For weeks I had been thinking of the buyers as people occupying my house. Sitting in that rental car, I finally understood it was their house. I wasn't looking at a life someone had taken from me. I was looking at a life I had completed. I drove to Austin without stopping again. Katie had prepared the guest room. My grandson had made a sign that said, "Welcome home, Grandma," in letters that prioritized feeling over spelling. Being with them was wonderful. For the first 3 days, I wondered why I had ever chosen to live so far away. Then Monday came. Katie and her husband went to work. The kids went to school. The house went quiet. They had schedules that existed before I arrived and would continue after I left. I joined what I could. But I was a guest inside a busy family's life. I searched for apartments nearby. The rent was higher than San Antonio. Driving was necessary. Living without a car was not realistic in any neighborhood I could afford. Katie offered to make permanent room. She meant it. But I could see what it would cost her. The home office would have to move. The kids would share more space. Their routines would gradually bend around mine. I had left Texas partly because I didn't want my retirement to become my children's burden. Moving into Katie's house because I had panicked would create exactly the future I had been trying to avoid. One evening after the kids were in bed, we sat at the kitchen table the way you do when a real conversation needs to happen. She asked whether I'd decided. I thought coming back would make it obvious, I said. And did it? I looked around her kitchen. I loved being there. I loved knowing that family was close. But I also missed my chair by the window in Cebu. I missed the bakery in the morning. I even missed the noise I'd been complaining about for months. No, I said. It made everything more complicated. But that wasn't entirely true. The visit had shown me one thing clearly. I hadn't been desperate to recover my old life. I had been desperate to know I still had a choice. I stayed in Austin for almost a month. During that time, I stopped trying to make a permanent decision based on whichever place I happened to miss that day. Instead, I wrote down what had frightened me in Cebu. The hospital night. The distance from family. Having no one nearby who knew my medications or my wishes. The cost and difficulty of returning to America if I needed to. None of those problems would disappear because I chose one country over the other. But some of them could be managed if I stopped pretending that courage meant having no backup plan. I called my insurance provider and asked detailed questions about emergency coverage and hospital networks in Cebu. I scheduled a follow-up with the specialist for after my return. I found a local group of older foreign residents who shared emergency contacts and practical information. Katie and I created a folder with copies of my passport, insurance documents, medication list, and financial accounts. I gave her access to everything she would need if I couldn't manage things myself. Then I opened a separate savings account. That money would not be invested or used for ordinary expenses. It would sit there as the cost of a choice. An emergency flight, temporary housing, the basic expense of returning to America if I ever truly decided to leave the Philippines. It wasn't enough to recreate the life I'd sold. Nothing could do that. It was enough to give me options. Katie also helped me build a plan for regular visits. 1 trip a year, budgeted in advance, with dates chosen before I left Austin so the grandchildren could count the months. Having a plan made the distance feel less permanent. The night before my flight, Katie asked whether I was certain about going back. No, I said. She looked surprised. Months earlier, I would have tried to convince her and myself that I had no doubts. This time I didn't need to. I'm not certain, I said, but I want to go back. That was enough. When I landed in Cebu, the familiar heat met me outside the airport. Traffic moved at its own pace. A motorcycle carrying what appeared to be an entire family passed the car with the casual confidence of people who had negotiated a separate agreement with physics. None of it felt charming. None of it felt threatening either. It was simply the life I was returning to. When I walked into the apartment building, the guard who had helped me the night of the hospital stood up from his chair. "You came back, ma'am," he said. I did. Upstairs, everything was where I'd left it. My chair by the window, the framed photographs, a coffee cup drying by the sink. The apartment was not the San Antonio house, and it never would be. Frank had never repaired anything there. My children had never opened Christmas presents in that living room. But it wasn't an anonymous rented room anymore either. It was a place I had chosen to come back to, and choosing to come back is different from never having left. Over the following weeks, I built a life that was less dependent on optimism and more dependent on planning. I attended my medical follow-up and kept copies of the results. I registered 2 local friends as emergency contacts and became one of theirs. We exchanged spare keys and agreed to check on each other if someone didn't respond to a message by a certain time. I joined a walking group that met 3 mornings a week instead of relying on occasional lunches. Seeing the same people regularly helped the friendships become something more than pleasant. I also stopped measuring every decision by how little it cost. Moving to the Philippines had reduced my expenses. But affordability alone could not build a meaningful retirement. I needed relationships, routines, and a sense of control over what would happen if things went wrong. Those things required effort. They also required money. For the first time, I allowed my retirement plan to include the possibility that I might not stay in Cebu forever. That possibility no longer felt like failure. It felt responsible. I still thought about the house in San Antonio. but I stopped searching for it online. What I'd been missing was never really the furniture or the car or even the house itself. I'd been missing the security I felt before I understood how quickly a life could change. Selling everything had destroyed the illusion that I could always go back. Building a real backup plan gave me something more useful, a way to move forward without pretending I would never change my mind. A few months ago, my real estate agent sent a message. She wanted to let me know the young family had completed several improvements: new fence, repainted exterior, a garden bed along the side of the house where Frank's workshop window used to be. She included a photograph. For a moment, I felt the familiar ache. Then I noticed the little girl standing next to the new garden bed, holding a watering can, smiling the way children smile when they're doing something important. Frank would have liked that. He believed houses should be lived in and taken care of and filled with noise. The house was doing exactly what it was meant to do. So was I. I had spent months believing that selling everything had left me with nothing to return to. But home was never going to be preserved exactly as I remembered it. Not in Texas, not in Cebu, not anywhere. Life continued while I was making plans and changing countries and trying to decide where I belonged. At 68, I thought starting over meant creating one perfect new life and leaving the old one behind. Now I understand it differently. Starting over doesn't require you to erase everything that came before. And keeping a way back doesn't mean you expect to fail. Sometimes the bravest decision isn't selling everything and boarding a plane. Sometimes it's allowing yourself enough time and money and flexibility to change your mind. I sold my house, my car, and nearly everything I owned because I wanted freedom. 5 months later, I panicked because I believed freedom had taken away all my choices. What I eventually discovered was that freedom isn't having nothing left to lose. It's knowing that wherever you are, you still have the ability to choose what comes next. If you're thinking about retirement abroad, or if you've already made the move and you're lying awake at 2 a.m. wondering whether you made a mistake, I want you to know something. Doubt is not the same as regret, and keeping a way back is not the same as giving up. If this story meant something to you, or if it sounded like a night you've had, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. There are more stories like this one, the honest ones. The ones where the answer isn't paradise or disaster, but something complicated in between. And if you've got your own version, leave it in the comments. I read everyone. Sometimes the most useful thing isn't advice. It's just knowing someone else was awake at 2 a.m. too.